couple of weeks ago, you mentioned generational sin. And you said that there was no scripture to support this, but what about Exodus 20, verse 5, question mark? And they quote it as saying, "You shall not worship them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands who those who love me and keep my commandments." Okay, end quote. There is the verse about punishing down to the third and fourth generation. How do we deal with this? Thank you. I guess even Cindy wants to know, how do you deal with it in your answer? Obviously, you were quite familiar with it just as I went into it. Go ahead.
Yeah, Cindy, no, there's no question about this. When I said that, I said there's no scriptural reference in the New Testament for generational sin. But there are four major references for generational sin in Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus. So where God actually says these things. So, now Jesus comes along, right? We see in John's Gospel, the famous passage where his disciples are asking about the man born blind, and says, Rabbi, whose sin was it that that man was born blind? And of course Jesus says, don't look at it that way. This, it's not about punishment for past sins. Now, the main thing to remember is, can theology and doctrine develop over the course of time? And the answer is yes, it does develop over the course of time. So there are certain things that are very prominent in the Old Testament, right, that are lost as we move along to later periods of the Old Testament, or are lost when we actually get to Jesus, the time of Jesus in the New Testament. For example, right, in Abraham's time, you could have many wives. Now, Moses comes along, and there is then, a progression, right? There's only going to be one wife and one husband, and there's going to be a faithful fidelity, right, to that contract of monogamy. So the main thing is, it's not just that, but right, we see a development in the notion of God's mercy. So remember in Judges, where, the daughter comes through the tent, right, and he's just made a vow to God, right, that, the first person that comes through the tent, I'm so happy for my victory today, I will sacrifice that person, and the daughter walks through. So he figures, I got to sacrifice my daughter. Well, of course, we see in the later prophets, and certainly in Jesus, we don't want blood sacrifices of people to begin with, and certainly you don't sacrifice your daughter for something that happened. So we've made some progress here. So what we call this is asymmetrical hermeneutics. That just means, that you can always look at the Old Testament from the fullness of revelation in the New Testament. So that's a fancy way of saying you can always look through the lens that Jesus provides us with, right? The lens that of the fullness of revelation, the fullness of God's love, the fullness of God's redemption, the fullness of God's mercy. You can look through that lens to the Old Testament to understand it. And of course, what's anachronistic, we do leave it behind, right? Jesus' revelation takes precedence over something that's older that conflicts with it. However, you can't go the other way. You cannot look at Jesus's fullness of revelation in the New Testament. You cannot look at that through the lens of the Old Testament, right? The Old Testament's categories are much narrower. The Old Testament's categories can't quite fit, right, all of the newness of revelation that Jesus has given. So if you're sitting there, right, trying to push all that fullness of Jesus into this vase that just can only contain this much, you're going to break the vase. And Jesus, of course, uses a similar image, right, when he says you can't pour new wine into old wineskins. Old wineskin won't contain it. If you do, it'll burst the old wineskin, and the new wine and the old skin will be lost. So that's something to reflect on. So yes, the idea of intergenerational sin is absent from the New Testament, but certainly not from the Old Testament. And we have to look at, seriously judging the view of intergenerational sin, right, that's in the Old Testament through the fullness of revelation that Jesus gives. And that idea Jesus pretty much has supplanted with the mercy of God rather than justice to the fourth generation.